You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Are you a forward thinker? Then you need an HR and finance platform that thinks like you do. Workday is the AI platform that helps propel your organization, your workforce, and your industry into the future. Workday, moving business forever forward.
What's worse than an ad interrupting your favorite music or podcast? That uninspired coffee you've been drinking while working, which is why Flavia is elevating your everyday coffee experience. Now you can enjoy cafe-quality beverages like coffee, tea, frothy lattes, and creamy hot chocolate made right in your home office, actual office, or wherever you want to upgrade your mug with bold, delicious flavors. Visit Flavia.com to shop the collection of machines and beverages now.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 221, The Battle About Britain, Part 5, A Simple River Crossing. This week, a big thank you goes out to Mark and Kieran for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast's episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. After the fall of France, the decision had been made by the German leaders to begin preparations for an invasion of Britain. Such a major operation would require a major planning effort from all of the branches of the Wehrmacht, and almost more importantly, it would require a level of cooperation between the Kriegsmarine and the Heer, the Navy and the Army, that up to that point in the war had not really been required. This would result in a series of disagreements throughout July and August 1940, that would occupy meeting after meeting and planning session after planning session. The core of the problem was that the two branches approached the operation from very different directions. The Army's approach was to determine how many men and how much equipment needed to be on the beaches in the first days, and then where those beaches needed to be to give the invasion the best chance of success. They were focused on the problems of what happened after those troops were landed and what they needed to be successful. The Navy's approach was to determine the available shipping, landing craft, transport craft, and protection for those assets, and then use those numbers as the basis for planning. They were focused on making the naval side of the operation a success, and they knew that there would be limited sea lift capacity. These two different approaches resulted in very different plans that would take time to come to an agreement on, and while all of those arguments were happening, Hitler decided to make one last attempt at bringing Britain to the negotiating table by giving a speech to the Reichstag on July 19th. The result of this speech would not be what he really hoped for. The speech that Hitler would give would be a great example of what German diplomacy looked like with Britain during the summer of 1940. It was a lengthy and somewhat rambling speech that would be called the last appeal to reason, with the idea being that Germany was completely ready to come to the negotiating table to end the war. You can read the full transcript of the speech online at archive.org. I'll include a link in the show notes. It's 10 pages, and it took a little over 2 hours to fully deliver. Hitler would point to the victories of the German military on the battlefield, the lenient terms that had been given to the Vichy French government, and that it was Britain that could make the decision any day to end the war. But there were two key issues with the speech that prevented it from having any real impact on the conflict. The first was that it was sorely lacking in details. One of the challenges faced by Britain and Germany in 1940, when it came to trying to start negotiations, is that they were, of course, at war, and they needed some starting place for negotiations to happen. This would have been an ideal moment for Hitler to have unveiled in detail what Germany's starting place would be in negotiations, perhaps including some concessions to give some power to the pro-peace factions within the British government. Instead of such proposals, a large portion of the speech just reiterated the talking points already provided by the Nazi government for why the war was the fault of the French and British from the very beginning. Hitler makes it clear that it was not the fault of Germany that the Polish provocations led to a wider war, and that the war then spilled into Norway and then into France. Hitler would then trumpet his own efforts to make peace earlier in the conflict. After the campaign in Poland had been completed, he would say, quote, "All this, as I said once before, need never have happened. For in October, I asked nothing from either France or Britain but peace. but the men behind the armaments industries wanted to go on with the war at all costs, and now they have got it." End quote. This is just one example of the first challenge that the speech had, and that was that it was short on the type of language required for a public declaration of a desire to begin negotiations to end a war. That would require humility, compassion, and public statements of the desire to compromise. The second challenge for the speech was that large sections of the speech were really just designed to trumpet and glorify the German military. In sections, it reads less like an appeal for peace and more like a rallying cry for the German people to unite behind the German military on their march to victory and glory. When speaking of the campaign in Norway, he would say, quote, "All the units of our German Navy covered themselves with imperishable glory in this action. Only after the war will it be possible to disclose the difficulties encountered in this campaign, such as setbacks and accidents. We finally overcame all difficulties thanks to the conduct of the officers and men." End quote. Then referring to events in France, quote, "The success of the most tremendous series of battles in the history of the world is due above all to the German soldier. He has proved again his worth in a convincing way in every battle in which he has fought. All branches of the German people take an equal share in this great achievement. The soldiers of the new provinces incorporated since 1938 have fought magnificently and have made their contribution to this heroic effort by all Germans." End quote. Then later in the speech, he would reference the actions on the home front during the first months of the war. Quote, "In conclusion of these purely military observations on the events, the love of truth compels me to pay due honor to the fact that all this would not have been possible had it not been for the attitude of the home front, and more particularly without the founding, the achievements, and the activity of the National Socialist Party." End quote. During the final sections of the speech, he of course has to throw in just some complete lies. It's tradition at this point. Quote, "Believe me, gentlemen, I feel a deep disgust for this type of unscrupulous politician who wrecks entire nations and states. It almost causes me pain to think that I should have been selected by fate to deal the final blow to the structure which these men have already set tottering. It never has been my intention to wage wars, but rather to build up a state with a new social order and the finest possible standard of culture. Every year that this war drags on is keeping me away from this work." There's a lot in that quote. We're not going to dig through every little piece, but just know that basically since the early 1920s, Hitler has been calling for war to kind of cleanse the world of those people he didn't like, essentially. And so here he is saying he didn't want a war. Total untruths. Then in the final few paragraphs, he would make his famous appeal. Quote, "In this hour, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as much as elsewhere. I consider myself in a position to make this appeal, since I am not the vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason." End quote. When I read through the speech, it does not feel like an appeal to reason, a call for negotiations, but instead a call for surrender. You don't spend most of a speech talking about how amazingly powerful and awesome your military is if you want to negotiate, but that's exactly what you would do if you wanted to overawe your enemy into surrender. When the British cabinet was informed of the speech and read its contents, they would ask Halifax to deliver the response. Now, it made a lot of sense for the Foreign Secretary, which is the position that Halifax was in, to deliver sort of the response to this address, and because he would be the one leading any possible negotiations. But it was also well known that it was Halifax who was the strongest advocate for peace among the British cabinet, and so the message coming from him made it clear that whatever the hopes were for the speech, they would remain unfulfilled. In his broadcast on the next day, Halifax would say, quote, "Hitler may plant the swastika where he will, but unless he can sap the strength of Britain, the foundations of his empire are based on sand." End quote.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. It's the ultimate bundle for an unbelievable price. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. Get it and watch Marvel Television's Ironheart on Disney Plus.
I want to build something iconic.
A new season of The Bear on Hulu.
We can make people happy.
and the epic A Minecraft Movie on Max.
Anything you can imagine is possible.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. All these and more streaming soon. Terms apply. Visit DisneyPlusHuluMaxBundle.com for details.
Going up.
Prices keep going up these days. It feels like being on an elevator that only goes up.
Going up.
But not at Metro. We're pushing the down button.
Going down.
We've lowered prices. Get one line of 5G data for $40, period. That's 20% lower. And you get a free Samsung 5G phone when you bring your number. Only at Metro.
5-year guarantee on eligible plans. Exclusions apply. See website for details. Not available at Metro with T-Mobile in the past 6 months. Tax applies.
With the failure of the last appeal to reason, preparations and planning for Sea Lion would continue. After Hitler's speech on July 19th, the Wehrmacht only had about 2 months to plan and execute the invasion, with the expectation being that the weather would be a major issue after mid-September. They were not going into the planning with a completely blank slate, though, and before the war there had been work done on preparing for a possible war against Britain. Within the Luftwaffe, there had been several studies done to try and determine the best path for an air campaign against Britain, with 2 notable examples being in September 1938 and August 1939. The result of these studies were not positive. The later study, which was completed just weeks before the start of the war, concluded that the Luftwaffe was incapable of achieving decisive results against the British. The only possibility would be to launch a long war of attrition, lasting at least 2 years, to wear down the British air defenses. Before the war, the German army also did some planning for the invasion, but even at that time, the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine were resistant to any plans from the Heer due to what they saw as unrealistic objectives. The Kriegsmarine had also done its own planning, but most of those plans were invalidated when the war started. The long-term plan for a war against Britain had been in the form of the Plan Z naval expansion program, which would have seen the German Navy grow massively in size. But those plans were still mostly only on paper when war was declared in September 1939, and most were put on hold due to reprioritization of manufacturing capacity. Without the massive expansion plan, the overall belief among the German naval leadership was that an invasion of Britain could not be successful, to the point where they put very little effort into planning for an invasion after the start of the war. And that was before the first 10 months of the war, which had cost the Kriegsmarine dearly, with the operations against Norway in particular being very costly. Further operations in the North Sea would also see damage to the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which meant that both would be in port for repairs during the summer of 1940. Before those costly actions, the naval staff would produce a plan for an assault on the British coast, with the plan being for landings to occur on the east coast of England. However, it appears that this study was mostly ignored at the time, as focus was still on events in France. Throughout all of these planning efforts, one of the key issues that Germany would face would be that the various arms of the military were making their own plans, and it was always difficult to get them to work together. Hitler was in a position to force them into alignment, but he was often resistant to make and force definitive plans, instead oscillating between the various competing visions for the operation, which for a very large amphibious landing is basically the worst thing you can do. All of these previous discussions and plans would form the basis for the wartime planning for the invasion, which would really get rolling in late June 1940, as the campaign in France was winding down. The problem hanging over all of the German planning, though, was that the best months to launch the invasion had already passed by the time that the campaign in France was winding down. The May through July timeframe would have been preferable, but those simply were not possible. But it did mean that the clock was ticking and the preparations had to be accelerated as the only option, or they had to be accelerated as much as possible, and they either had to happen in the next few months or they would have to wait till 1941. This resulted in many situations in which preparations had to blindly power ahead, even though the exact plan was still unknown. And this would also be the period of greatest divergence between the German military leaders, even though there would be multiple times when the German Navy, led by Admiral Raeder, tried to inform the other branches of the correct level of possibilities. One of these instances would be during a meeting on June 20th, even before the French armistice, in which Raeder would give a report on a variety of invasion-related topics. This included the Navy's preferred landing sites and the shipping that would be available for the operation. This was at a time when the general outlines for the German Army's plan were massive and completely unworkable. Raeder would speak out against these plans, saying that the shipping was simply unavailable. Unfortunately, the German naval leader did not get much help from Hitler in this instance, as his mind was already moving on to other topics, including fanciful ideas of a German invasion of Iceland to control the Atlantic, and the plans to deport all of Germany's Jews to Madagascar. Throughout June, multiple orders were given out to the German military arms to continue planning, though. First, it was exploratory items that tried to determine if an invasion was possible, and then later more detailed planning on how it would be executed. A little over a week later, the OKW produced a plan for setting up more detailed planning with the German General Staff, including the idea that the entire operation should be treated like a mighty river crossing. This idea was absurd, I'm just going to use that word, because crossing the English Channel and then being completely dependent on supplies from the sea made it far different than any kind of river crossing. But river crossings were a thing that the German army knew about, it had planned for, it had practiced on. And so that was the mindset they went into it with. What if river crossing, but bigger? And that's not really what amphibious operations are, because river crossings imply that at some point you'll establish a bridge, maybe, over the river, and that greatly simplifies the supply situation. As I've discussed in previous episodes, everything started with the Luftwaffe, and nothing could truly move forward until they had achieved their objectives of suppressing, if not destroying, the abilities of the RAF to react to an invasion. This was never going to be easy, and it took time for the plans and preparations to be made, even as the Channel War continued. There were many tasks that the Luftwaffe was not used to planning for or executing on, because most of their experiences up to that point had been in operations in conjunction with the Army. There was also a growing concern throughout July that the Luftwaffe did not appear to be doing as much as it could. Now, this wasn't really true. They were planning as quickly as possible. But around Germany, there was a noted drop in excitement in the German population, with the head of Nazi propaganda, Goebbels, writing, quote, "Wonderful weather, too good for our Air Force," end quote. This seeming lack of activity would continue until July 20th, even at a time when the plan for the invasion was for it to go forward on August 15th, which left the Luftwaffe dangerously short of time. At the front, the Luftwaffe was doing almost everything that it could to be ready for the tasks ahead, including updating its target lists, and one of the major areas of concern were the odd towers that the British had erected and which were emanating various electronic signals. These were, of course, the Chain Home series of radar stations, and while the Germans did not know the specifics of exactly how they worked or what they were doing, they did know what radar was, and so the assumption was made that these were some kind of early warning radar system. Once they were identified by the German radio monitoring service, new orders were given out to the Luftwaffe leaders that they needed to add them to their target lists for the opening days of the attacks. What exactly they were doing did not matter, just that it would be better if they no longer existed. Overall, the plans that were confirmed by Goering on July 20th would result in a continuation of the Channel War for the next few weeks, until a high-level meeting would be held on August 1st, where the Luftwaffe plans would be finalized. The meetings would see some interesting disagreements between the Luftwaffe High Command and the Luftflotten commanders that were closer to the front, these being Spurl and Kesselring. The primary concern was that the Luftwaffe leaders of the Luftflotten to be involved in the fighting did not believe that German bombers should be doing anything over Britain until the British fighter force was greatly damaged, maybe even destroyed. But this was simply not possible given the time frame. The Luftwaffe could not wait for any kind of war of attrition to occur between German and British fighters. Instead of a long war of attrition, they would start a 13-day plan for the complete destruction of the RAF, the objective that the vast majority of the Luftwaffe's strength would be committed to. These 13 days would be split into 3 phases, with each phase designed to push the destruction closer and closer to London, under the idea that it was in those areas of England that the RAF was strongest and also the areas that the RAF would commit the greatest part of their strength to defend. The first 5 days would be focused on areas between 150 and 100 kilometers of London. The second phase would push it into 100 to 50 kilometers, and the final phase would be within 50 kilometers of London itself. Between each of these 3 phases, there would be a break day to evaluate and prepare for the next phase. I like this quote from To Defeat the Few by Douglas C. Dildy and Paul F. Crickmore, which serves as a very clear criticism of the Luftwaffe's plans at this point in time, which I completely agree with. Quote, "For daylight operations, by choosing such a geographically based rollback strategy, it's readily apparent that the Luftwaffe's leadership viewed their challenge from a ground-based, almost army perspective. Experienced only at the tactical level and never trained or educated as military professionals at the operational or strategic levels of conflict, the Luftwaffe's leaders were almost without exception unequipped to address the problem from an air power perspective." End quote. I like this criticism specifically because it highlights how you cannot always map concepts between different military capabilities. In theory, pushing the area of the attacks closer to London seems fine, but it highlights the fact that the exact area being focused on by the Luftwaffe actually didn't matter. The RAF could always base fighters outside of those zones and continue to attack the Luftwaffe every time German planes were over England. It's just a lack of understanding of how these campaigns needed to be structured to see results. This is a good preview of what would actually end up happening during the height of the battle in August and September, when a critical part of the RAF's response to German raids was actually to attack them with squadrons from outside of the main area of attack. This is just one more example of how the Luftwaffe was not given the time to accomplish the goals that it needed to accomplish for an invasion to be successful. Next episode, we'll dig deeper into the planning for the invasion, as the German plans go from completely absurd to something slightly less absurd, but maybe still not possible.